Why hello there, and welcome back to Tabletop Ferox. So if you've been following my content, you likely know that I recently finished Let's Making Us a Character for all 7 editions of Gamma World, as well as Metamorphosis Alpha, which I consider a 0th edition of Gamma World. And after all of that, you might find yourself wanting to experience the weird and wacky world of Gamma for yourself. But with 8 editions and 8 videos totaling like 5.5 hours of content, you might not be sure where to start. Well, fortunately for you, that's literally what this video is, as indicated by the title and thumbnail, and that's probably why you clicked on it. So basically, what I'm going to do here is briefly go over some of the pros and cons of each edition, and hopefully help you figure out which edition of Gamma World may be the right one for you. And then you can start watching those 5.5 hours of videos, or if you already watched them, you can watch them again. That's allowed and encouraged. So let's start in the most logical place to do so, the end, with D&D Gamma World, also known as 7th edition, from 2010, which of course is the edition that is going to feel most familiar to modern players. Like, it's not 5th edition, so if you're one of those people, then you might as well just stop watching now. None of them are going to be 5th edition. But being based on D&D 4th edition, it is the one that comes closest to that list of things you can do style of limited play that those players will be most comfortable with. Character creation can reasonably be done in like 10 minutes, and more imaginative players will enjoy having the freedom to define their origins and weapons. However, others may struggle having to come up with those ideas rather than just having them given to you. And the rest of the rules, while fairly minimal, are also fairly simple. Even the bad parts. Like, you may find yourself wondering why the rules are like this, but never wondering what the rules are. Like, if you watch my video on 7th edition, I pretty much explained all of the rules. It is, however, also going to be one of the most expensive or inconvenient options available, which is pretty much entirely due to the collectible card element that was put in at least partially as an asinine attempt to prevent the game from being playable with just a PDF, which, as you can imagine, makes it very difficult to play the game with just a PDF, which is the way in which it is currently sold. So you have this collectible card element that is required to play, and your options are to either buy the print-on-demand cards, which I do not recommend because giving money to Wizards of the Coast is never the correct option, or just, like, get the files somehow, maybe. I don't know. Is that a thing you can do? Can you find digital files on the internet other than through official channels? I wouldn't know how to do that, and I'm sure you don't know either. But, you know, maybe that's a thing that could be done. I mean, I've never heard of it happening, but it could possibly be a thing that maybe someone might like to investigate. But then even when you do have the files, you need to then either print them out, which is going to also be expensive and inconvenient, or, like, keep them in a digital file and roll for the cards and then reference that PDF, which is going to be very inconvenient when you have to do that for every single encounter. Although, of course, there is also the most reasonable option, which is just to house rule the cards out of the game. Basically, there is no cheap, convenient way to just sit down and play 7th edition without having to finagle some sort of workaround for the cards. And also, all of the other physical elements, like tokens and maps that came in the box, are also now largely useless, because even if you are playing on a virtual tabletop, you still have to edit and then import all that content yourself. Ironically, while the box set format was actually convenient for the people who had it, it now makes this a very, very inconvenient version of the game to play. So, tonally, I would say this is the most Gamma World of all the modern editions. But that's also not an incredibly high bar to pass, and has a fairly modern design, with simple, fun, and imaginative character creation. Like, this has one of the most interesting character creation concepts that I have probably ever seen, as well as just some generally simple and easy to learn rules. Like, it is a simplified version of 4th edition, which is already a very simple game. That is simple, except for those parts that were specifically added to make the game unplayable without those physical elements, which now must be bought, created, or house ruled out of the game. And because of the box set format focusing on those extras, as well as having an overall lifespan of 4 months, the official content for this game is going to be extremely limited. So, obviously, this is going to be the edition that is best for 4th edition players who never moved on, and also 5th edition players who are a bit apprehensive about trying a game that doesn't have a Make Character button. So, now on to 6th edition from 2003, and I will not mince words here, this is the worst playable edition of the game, and is actually just a campaign setting for D20 Modern, which, for those who are unfamiliar, is basically a tribute to Wizards of the Coast's hubris in assuming that they could literally replace every other game on the market with a watered-down version of D&D 3rd edition. And that isn't me making an accusation, that was their stated business plan at the time. But watered down only in what you get out of it. If anything, it's actually more complicated and cumbersome than D&D 3rd edition, because as a game that is supposed to cover every single genre, it has to be incredibly broad with its rules, while also fitting into the incredibly restrictive framework of the D&D 3rd edition rules. It is basically a system that just strangles whatever content you try to put into it. And this edition also happens to be published by White Wolf, a company that is very well known for putting out books that don't necessarily contain all of the information that they are supposed to. So it is a very fiddly system with a lot of moving parts, and a book that doesn't necessarily explain how all of those parts move. Also, fitting into the rigid structure of the D20 system stifled a lot of the chaotic wackiness the Gamma World was known for. And let's be honest here, I'm not sure that wackiness was exactly a thing that White Wolf understood. They were more an angsty game company. So, it is a D20 Modern game, if that's your thing. But it is also, unfortunately, still a D20 Modern game, if that is not your thing. So it is going to be very complicated and cumbersome, and give you very little in return for what you invest into it. And yes, I am biased against D20 Modern, but I am biased against D20 Modern because it is a bad game. Also, just being a campaign setting means that there are a lot of intentional gaps in the rules that need to be filled in with the D20 Modern core book. But being from White Wolf, it's also not incredibly clear where those gaps are, or what those blanks need to be filled in with. And also, at times, is a little unclear about how that content is to be incorporated into the Gamma World game. And then, of course, also there are a few unintentional gaps in the rules that you just need to fill in yourself. Also, just in terms of overall tone, it does feel more generic, edgy early 2000s than it does distinctly Gamma World. Basically, it's like the gritty reboot that no one asked for, as was the style at the time. Seriously, if you did not have to live through it, there were so many gritty reboots in the 2000s. It was horrible. So really the only person I could recommend this edition to would be a die-hard D20 Modern fan. But a die-hard D20 Modern fan probably already has an arguably better generic post-apocalyptic sourcebook for D20 Modern. Which brings us to 5th edition, from the year 2000. And this one is very interesting, as it is a campaign setting for Alternity, just one with rules included, also known as a complete game. I just find it fascinating that they did not have the language at the time to specify this is a different complete game that uses the same mechanics as this other game. Alternity being a science fiction role-playing game that was in development at TSR at the time that TSR got purchased by Wizards of the Coast, and actually was published by Wizards of the Coast during the time that they were still publishing TSR products under the TSR brand. Yep, for a brief time, Wizards of the Coast was actually publishing content for 2 different game systems at the same time. I know, amazing. And being based on Alternity means that this is the only playable edition of the game to not really be based on the rules for Dungeons & Dragons, instead being based on a roll-under D20 system, which is then modified by a situation die that is either added to or subtracted from your roll and goes up and down based on all kinds of things. And, as I said, is actually a very interesting system, especially for the novelty of being a different D20 system from Wizards of the Coast in the late 90s, early 2000s. Unfortunately, it is also a system that sits in a very weird place between older, heavy crunch and modern, sleek design. Like, the core mechanic is actually quite sleek and elegant and simple, but the numbers you have to put into that system take a little work to actually get. Things like dealing with a variable cost point buy skill system, a thing that I'm pretty sure nobody ever wants to see. It also feels very much like a reskin, to the point that certain elements that have been added to it have been taken directly from the Alternity setting. Also, some of the rules just kind of got lost in the translation from Alternity to Gamma World, so you might occasionally need to look in the Alternity book to find a rule. So overall, mechanically at least, it is the most interesting, playable version of Gamma World, and does have some interesting options. But those mechanics also have some awkward and cumbersome elements that are going to feel very, very boring and inconvenient to modern players, and honestly, anyone who's just done with a whole sheet of skills. And it also does feel a little lacking in content, being the only edition of Gamma World with no supplementary releases outside of a single article in Dragon Magazine. And like 6th edition, it does feel a bit more just like a generic, edgy, post-apocalyptic reskin of Alternity than it does a distinctly Gamma World game. Like, not as bad as 6th edition, they have taken some of the distinctive elements of Gamma World and featured them prominently, but also in a way that doesn't feel particularly meaningful, or worth what was lost to have them. So, best for people who want to check out a new system, especially people who are interested in this particular era of tabletop gaming and would like to see what the people who made D&D were doing other than D&D. However, most of the positive things I have to say about this game also apply to Alternity, and probably better to Alternity, because that is the game that the mechanics were actually designed for. And that was the last modern edition, or rather first because I'm going backwards, which means now it's time for the TSR era, and 4th edition, from 1992, which is honestly probably one of the most complete versions of Gamma World. and is the old school edition that is going to feel most familiar to modern players. Like, it has character classes and ability modifiers, and a nearly unified D20 plus modifier versus target system. But who rolls, what is added, and if versus means roll over or under is going to vary based on different tasks. Basically, this is the first edition that really looked at D&D and said, hey, maybe we should do something better than this. And then did. Like, this is probably closer to D&D 3rd edition, which wouldn't come out for another 8 years and from a different publisher, than it is D&D 2nd edition, which had just come out 3 years prior. The best example probably being the changes that were made to the combat mechanics, cutting out a lot of unnecessary baggage like THAC0 and descending armor class, in favor of, as I said earlier, roll a d20, add a modifier, and compare it to an armor class. Essentially, the basic combat mechanics of every successive edition of Dungeons & Dragons. And I'm just going to say it here before people start arguing in the comments, yes, ascending armor class is objectively better, always has been, always will be. Like, looking at this thing retroactively, yeah, it is not as balanced or unified as games from the 2000s and later. But it's also from 1992, and looking at it in its actual historical context, it was doing a lot of stuff that was ahead of its time. Also, as mentioned, this is a very complete edition of the game, and actually contains stats for all of the mutant animal and plant types. Something that no edition before or after had done. Actually, mutant plants and animals just as a broad character type were more or less phased out after this edition. It also has a wide yet reasonable selection of mutations. Some of the more extreme options, like ones that let you travel hundreds of years into the past or future, be 25 feet tall, or take double or triple damage from all sources, have been removed or toned down to more reasonable versions. And just in general, there are actual rules for most of the things that you are going to want to do in the game. Like, not everything, but they have you covered in most situations. So overall, a very well-developed and mostly coherent system with a lot of options that were not included in earlier editions or later editions. And also the most supplemental content of any other edition. And does very much retain that classic Gamma World feel, with some very reasonable concessions made in the name of game balance. However, it is still a 30-plus-year-old game, so if you're expecting a modern, unified, and balanced to a fault system, it is not that. There are going to be things that are broken, awkward, and unforgiving. That's just the way the game is. But still, overall is what I would consider the best option overall for the average player who wants that classic Gamma World experience with the least hassle. Like, despite being considerably older, this is actually going to be easier to get into than something like 5th or 6th edition due to not having these elaborate frameworks of skills and subsystems that those games rely on. But now it is time for the reason that I had to specify playable when I called 6th edition the worst and 5th edition the most interesting. 3rd edition, from 1986. And as implied just now, it is by far the most interesting edition of the game. Just, you know, not one that's exactly playable. It is the only edition of Gamma World to not use a D20 based system, instead relying on a color-coded D100 table, which is complicated, but not as complicated as it seems. And actually has a lot of potential to it that was unfortunately not really utilized well. Because the other thing is, this is one of, if not the most unfinished thing I have ever seen from a real publisher. It is nearly impossible to go more than a few steps in any direction without running into rules that conflict with other rules, or other versions of the same rule but written in a different part of the book, or rules that just don't make sense or aren't there. It is so bad that they actually published a rules supplement for it, which is basically just a giant errata, which added some of the rules that were missing and complete redesigns of a lot of the content, but most notably actually states that they were so rushed to put the game out that they cut a whole bunch of content and then just didn't really bother editing the rest of the game to reflect the fact that said content was not in it. But even with those additional rules, it still feels very much like something that is at least 2 drafts away from something that you should have even considered publishing. The only explanation I can even think of for how it got that bad is that the switch to the action table was made at the last minute and they just weren't given time to edit the rest of the rules to reflect that. But even then, it still feels like you are looking at rules from at least 3 different versions of the game. So, a game with an interesting resolution system, but other than that, a completely broken, incomplete mess. And I don't know, if I had to recommend this for someone, it would be someone who likes the idea of the action table so much that they are willing to house rule a massive amount of other content to even make it playable. Like, I recommend reading it. Like, it's definitely worth checking out, just don't bother trying to play it. But now on to another playable version of the game, 2nd edition from 1983. And this is going to be your very old school Gamma World, with all of the assorted matrices and associated mechanics, as well as aforementioned mutations that let you travel hundreds of years into the past or future, be 25 feet tall, take double damage from all sources, or have water-soluble skin. It is also more or less just a revision of 1st edition, versus all of the later editions, which were all moderate to radical redesigns. And comparatively has more and much better explained rules, including an entire attribute check system, which 1st edition did not have. But also different from 1st edition, it has a much stronger focus on the social aspect of the game. There is a lot of mechanical focus on a character's standing in their community and the benefits thereof, like to the point that character advancement is entirely social. As you level up, you essentially gain more status in your community, gaining access to more and better equipment and hirelings, but never really getting stronger. Outside of adding your level to your charisma score. That is how socially focused it is. Charisma is a key attribute. So this is the real old school version of Gamma World. For better or worse. It's going to have the wild and unbalanced rules, but also those wild and unbalanced rules are going to be awkward, cumbersome, brutal, and honestly just unfair at times. It is a very die from radiation poisoning if you happen to come within 6 meters of the giant moth kind of game. Like, that is an actual example from the rules. And while it is significantly more revised and filled out than 1st edition, there's also still going to be a lot of stuff that isn't provided, like aforementioned mutant animal and plant statistics. Even things such as whether or not a mutant animal can talk or have usable hands is just stated to be up to the GM's interpretation. And players who are only familiar with more unified systems in modern games might find some of the mechanics awkward, cumbersome, or confusing, with roll under percentile skill checks and cross-reference and roll a d20 on a table combat mechanics. And I guess best for people who never really got past Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st Edition, or who just want to check out this very specific era of early 80s kinda okay tabletop role-playing games. And now to get even older school, 1st Edition from 1978. And as I said, is essentially the same version of the game as 2nd Edition, just with significantly fewer refinements. So there are less rules for less things, and the rules that are there are much more poorly explained. The only notable mechanical difference being that lack of social focus, with an advancement system that instead relies on rolling up random bonuses when you level up. So it is the original Gamma World, with all of the faults that come with that. It is a game with very limited mechanics, basically just giving you combat and exploration rules. So even compared to something like 2nd Edition, there are going to be a lot of blanks that the GM is just going to have to fill in, and the further you get away from those core elements, the more things are going to have to be house ruled. And honestly, this is one that I just can't really recommend to anyone. If you like what this game offers, 2nd Edition basically does everything that this edition does, but better. And if you don't like those socially focused rules, you can just ignore them. You can take the advancement system from this game and put it in 2nd Edition. Nobody is going to try and stop you. So in terms of gameplay, yeah, 2nd Edition is objectively better than 1st. However, maybe there is a different reason why you would want to play this particular version of Gamma World. Maybe you are more interested in experiencing it as a historical gameplay experience rather than just one for funsies. Well, in that case, Metamorphosis Alpha from 1976. As I said, I consider this to be basically a 0th edition and the real original version of Gamma World. And is the edition that I would recommend if your interest is more in experiencing a piece of tabletop gaming history. Like, not just for Gamma World, I would recommend Metamorphosis Alpha, and Boot Hill, and Tunnels and Trolls, before I would recommend actually trying to play original Dungeons & Dragons. As far as I'm concerned, if you're interested in checking out 70s role-playing games, this is actually going to be your best option. And at only 32 pages long, while the rules are incredibly minimal, they're also very easy to digest. Also, being as early as it isn't really making that much of an effort to be like Dungeons & Dragons, and instead was just trying to be Metamorphosis Alpha. Because as a whole, the series does tend to become more like Dungeons & Dragons as it goes on. Except for whatever was going on with 3rd edition, and, 4th edition actually influencing later editions of Dungeons & Dragons, and 5th edition being based on a completely different game, which arguably was also influenced by 4th edition. So a historically important game, but also one that even new players shouldn't have much trouble getting into. Although let's be honest here, new players generally don't have that much trouble getting into games. It's players with an established history in a different game that have the problems. However, a lot of that simplicity comes from incredibly minimal rules, which require the GM to fill in a lot of blanks. Like, as I mentioned earlier, 1st edition and this do not have an attribute check system. If you want an attribute check system, you have to come up with one on your own. But that's just what games were like back then. And if you are able to make quick decisions and change those decisions if they end up being the wrong decisions, then you should be fine with this game. Also, there was actually a pretty good amount of supplementary content in Dragon Magazine if you want to go and look for that. Which is why I so highly recommend this specific game for people who are interested in seeing what tabletop role-playing was like in the 70s. It is a part of gaming history that is actually worth experiencing, as opposed to original Dungeons & Dragons, which isn't. So there we go, 35 years, 8 editions of Gamma World, and also Metamorphosis Alpha, and hopefully you now have a pretty good idea of which one of those editions might be the right one for you. And my overall recommendation, if you just skip to the end, if you just want to experience the Gamma World game that you've heard about for years, 4th edition is going to be your best option. For a classic player, for a modern player, 4th edition is going to be the easiest to get into and give you the best experience with the least hassle. It hasn't had its sharp edges ground off and been weighed down with cumbersome mechanics like later editions have, but it's also much less of an unwieldy mess than previous editions. And if you just want to play the game without going through a lot of trouble, is going to be the best way to do that. However, if your interest is less in just playing the game and more in experiencing tabletop gaming history, then I recommend skipping all the way back to Metamorphosis Alpha. It's not a very deep experience, but it is one that's going to be very easy to get into and fairly easy to understand, especially for something as old as it is. Also, personally, I just like the setting more. That's a me thing. And hopefully now you, the viewer, have all the information you need to decide which one of my Gamma World videos you will watch next. You could just watch all of them. That would actually be my recommendation. And thank you for watching. If you want more of my special brand of wit and insight, you can follow me on Blue Sky, Twitter, even Tumblr. Especially Tumblr. There are links in the description. And extra special thanks to my Fight and Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, D-Stex, Hasterfan, Mix Woofers, Nikolai Snowtail, Randy Mulholland, Renee D, Stephen Kramer, Tila Glar, Toshirokuro, and Tyro the Fox. If you'd like to be cool like them, check out my Patreon. Also, channel memberships are now a thing, so you can check those out too. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that the dark, unseen hand of the YouTube algorithm has lovingly selected for you, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.